While we're in the 1970s, you met a guy, Phil Hamlin. Why don't you give us your comments, your thoughts on Phil Hamlin?
Yeah, that was an interesting man. It was in the early days. We were over on Old Middlefield in the first building, right next to Egg Express. Believe it or not, these guys, their business was boiling eggs every night, peeling them, and delivering them to restaurants. Excellent. Yeah, called Egg Express. Larry Climby, who was a printer, and another guy, I can't remember his name now, Bob or Dave or somebody. And he did, but they were old friends and partners. And anyway, so you'd come in the morning and it smelled like sulfur. And, but that was our first building. I mean, our office chairs for visitors were lawn chairs. I remember Fast Eddie Loswig, who never weighed less than 350 pounds, but showed up probably when he weighed 400 one day. Wanted to see how I was doing. He's from New York. Brilliant man, marketeer, engineer. Used to work in the military electronics business. Had great ideas. He was in the rep business at the time, working with my old friend Hal Stout. And I had these lawn chairs. So Eddie stood up. And it never occurred, Ed, sit down. And it never occurred to me until he left. Well, if he would have, on the floor. But anyway, Glenn knew the chief technician at Santa Clara. They were just building the system. It was a system that was a small an MSO at the time called H&B American out of L.A. had just been purchased by Teleprompter. They had the first Hamlin set-top converters, the ones that looked like the notepad, or it was a really clever idea. Gold-plated with a leatherette top. Remember Phil's sales pitch. Gold flash. Corded remote. And this guy, Glenn Cross, who was the technician, knew Vince pretty well, and he called, and Vince said, Glenn wants to come up and he wants you to look at some of these converters, he says, because they don't work. The old cable TV term, got beats. These had beats. And we didn't really have much to test them with other than a couple of signal generators. So, I looked, this mixer isn't really worth a darn. And, of course, they were beginning to do greater than octave things. So they needed a mixer with, second-order performance, and didn't have it. So I looked at it, and I said, Glenn, there's a way around this. If we put in a switchable low-pass, high-pass filter somewhere in the middle of the FM band, and said we can resolve almost all of these problems. He said, oh, okay. He said, well, so we just put a little breadboard together and with a switch on the front of the thing and stuck it inside the box, and he took it down in the system and he said, hey, this works. He must have called his boss, or he called the Bob Beeman, who was the director of engineering for H&B, who in turn called Roger Wilson, who was teleprompter director, VP of engineering in New York. And Roger lived in Daly City, or his wife did, and he came back from New York on weekends. Roger was a really nice guy. But anyway, the next morning, in the parking lot is Phil Hamlin. And apparently he flew down from Seattle and was waiting for me. And he says, I need to know what you did. So I told him what we did. He said, I got 60,000 of these things on a boat. coming over here. And he said, I don't have any money, or a lot of money left. He said, but I need to get these working right so I can release the letter of credit to pay for them. And so anyway, showed him the little board, how we did it, some recommendations how to do it, and he came back and said, well, need some help. So he said, we're going to have to modify them here. So he went. This is what Phil was able to do. Phil was literally a one-man show. I mean, at the time, it was just him and Tom Manami, a guy who used to climb poles for him up in Seattle, who was an accountant, almost blind. He's a Korean guy that was born in Japan. He was an outcast in the Japanese eyes. So even though he was a Japanese citizen, the Japanese people didn't like him. But anyway, Tom worked for him, and he had an agent in Tokyo by the name of Mike Mifune, who became a longtime friend as well. So he managed to get General Corporation of Japan to send over a team of people. He rented a facility in Signal Hill, close to the port in California, where the converters came in, and proceeded to modify every one of these things on his own nickel. I helped him with the setup and stuff like that. Ultimately went over to Japan on the next generation product and spent almost a month with him, and he was looking for Taiwanese suppliers at the time as well. Never forget, back in the 70s, you visit a Taiwanese facility and they showed you this big empty building where they used to do some very crude TV sets. And they were building some of the ferrite memory type calculators, Nixie tubes. And the next day we visited their headquarters in downtown Taipei, and we walked through the accounting office, and they're all using Abacus. They made calculators, but they didn't use them. Yeah, it's funny. But Phil and I became longtime friends. I stayed in touch with him until his death. And he suffered a very untimely death almost 3 years ago now. He was murdered in his own home by a caregiver's husband.
One of the things that impressed me was your description of how he managed to finance these set tops, especially these first set tops.
Well, Phil was a good business guy. He had a good business head. He had done a lot of products in Japan, audio products in Japan prior to the cable business. Made amplifiers, speakers, things like that. He was one of the first. He had one of the very few 100% American-owned businesses in Japan, because he was there before they changed the rules, where you had to have majority Japanese ownership. But he financed these things through irrevocable letters of credit, and so he just as soon as the product shipped, then he got his money, and. The Japanese had enough faith in him as a business person that they required no money. They would build it on his say-so. That he ordered 100,000 units. They'd build 100,000 units. They know they were going to get paid, and they had the confidence. He would deliver 1 million and 2 million set-top boxes a year with a company that had 8 people in it. Really. It was just him, Jim Forgey. Jim was an old Gerald guy, had a lot of contacts with the high end, like, Bob Magnus. He was personal friends with all those guys, and so that helped a lot. With Annixter Brothers, Jack Pruzan, That's how he ended up selling a lot of this stuff. And then, of course, Egan got involved. And but Phil never sold the business. He liquidated it.
I didn't realize that.
Yep. He basically gave the rights to sell it for a small commission to Egan, Annixter. And they sold the product for a few years with his name.
I remember one of the things you said about Phil was it seemed to be very generous, and as far as you'd go up there and you'd stay with him, right? You wouldn't stay in a hotel.
Oh, always, yeah. No, always you stayed with him, yeah, sure. No, he was we do a lot. He was a pilot. He had a house in Lake Chelan, which is central Washington. He had a house in Puget Sound, and he had a house in on one of the lakes around Orlando, north of Orlando, on the St. Charles River, I think it is. Then he had a seaplane in both. He kept it at Boeing Field. He'd fly it to Chelan in the summertime, and then when he had another seaplane, he was down at when he was in Orlando. He had one there. He had an old German neighbor that he ultimately gave the plane to because when he had some heart condition and he couldn't fly anymore. He gave his planes away to people that he liked. So the old German guy is one that he gave the plane to out back there in Florida. I remember one day we were flying, you do the craziest things. I mean, the whole house was Japanese themed. And they were going to cook some Japanese meal. They'd run out of, heaven forbid, run out of tofu. But there's only one place to get tofu, and it's at some island out there off of Seattle. So he and I go down to Boeing Field, jump in the seaplane, and we land, and taxi up to this dock. He goes in and gets whatever tofu he needs, and we fly back. And, it's probably a $500 a few pounds of tofu or something. I don't know. It was crazy. Oh yeah. Well, Phil never kept any secrets about his wealth, and he would flaunt it. But he and Jim both bought Prevo motorhomes, the great big ones, the buses. And it was, it's a game of can you top this that they both played with each other. But anyway, he had this one, the first one he got, and he bought a trailer that matched, had the same chrome stripes, painted the same color. So they'd pull into a campground, and he'd get out with his remote control, the back door would come down, and he'd back out his Bentley. So they traveled across the road. Jim had a Mercedes in his, I think. But Phil had a Bentley. One of his few Bentleys, but no, one was a Rolls. The one he had in Florida was a Rolls. But he was a very, very smart, very astute guy, and he lived a long time. He had mobility issues towards the end, but his mind was as sharp as ever. He read a lot, surfed the internet when his vision allowed, but he just came to an untimely death. He would have easily lived to 100, I'm sure.